This video is a highlight of our Zoom Out, Taking Action for the Green Recovery event, the second of a two-part series looking at climate action called Zoom In, Zoom Out by the 2050 Climate Group. We hope you enjoyed this as much as the attendees did on the day.
So, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are absolutely delighted to be sharing our Saturday morning and afternoon with you all. My name's Scott and I am one of the operational volunteers with the 2050 Climate Group. I'll be one of your co-hosts today alongside Ava, who you've just heard from. This session is the second of two events in our climate action series. We ran the first session called Zoom In on the 13th of March, where we focused on actions we can take in our local communities. This time, we're taking the magnifying glass and zooming out and looking at what action we can take beyond our local communities, importantly, how we can support Scotland's green recovery. Today, you'll have the chance to learn something about the green recovery, as well as develop your skills and hopefully build your confidence. But you're doing a great job, honestly, just by turning up this morning. So we'd like to congratulate you and really just thank you first and foremost for that. To go over to what to expect today, we have two fabulous guest speakers in the form of firstly our keynote speaker, Dr. Deborah Long, who is Chief Officer at the Scottish Environment Link. He will be followed then by Dr. Jan Maskell of Scientists for Global Responsibility. It is time to introduce then our keynote talk by Dr. Deborah Long. Dr. Deborah Long is the Chief Officer at the Scottish Environment Link, the network for environmental NGOs in Scotland, and has been in post since February 2019. Dr. Deborah Long's role is to ensure the effective delivery of Link's strategic vision, to deliver a strong, coherent voice in pursuit of a sustainable Scotland. Trained as a paleoecologist, Deborah maintains an active interest in plants and growing and spends as much time as she can outdoors in Scotland across the world through sea kayaking, cross-country skiing and hill walking. Today's session will be about the colour of hope, a green recovery in Scotland. We live in times of change, climate change, nature loss and a global pandemic. They all reflect broken natural systems and the broken relationship we have with our planet. Solving these crises one by one won't work. A green recovery must tackle all three at once and achieve results within the next few years. This is obviously a huge challenge. As Rachel Carson, the famous American marine biologist and conservationist, said in 1962, to have risked so much in our efforts to mold nature to our satisfaction and yet to have failed in achieving our goal would indeed be the final irony. Yet this seems to be our situation. If this is our situation, then it does beg the question, what's next? The best answer and the brightest hope is to work together, diversity in approach, geography, and at scale, they enable us all to contribute to the transformative changes required. This talk will outline some of the challenges and how a diversity of approaches by us all will help us overcome them bit by bit. And without further ado, over to you, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you all for asking me to come along today. I'm just going to share my screen now, so you can all see that, hopefully. The great thing about having a wide brief to talk about a green recovery in Scotland is that I can talk about whatever I want to talk about, but that's also the bad thing as well, because it means that there's so much stuff that I could talk about. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour. And this is a bit of a personal journey, really. I'm using examples of what we're doing in Scottish Environment Link, both as a network and from our members, in terms of what we're doing and some of the tactics we're adopting. And I'm hoping that they will be helpful to you as well. And one of the key things I'd like to get out of today is kind of an ambition to work more together, really. Scott's already outlined that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm just going to move there, that's better. Sorry, I'm just fiddling about my screen a little bit so I can see my buttons. Scott mentioned I'm Chief Officer of Link. I've been in post for about 2 years. And before that, I worked on a European funded project. It was Horizon 2020 project, working with 19 partners across 9 different European countries. And we were working on a citizen science project, looking at soil management and growing food. It was fantastic. And that's exactly the sort of project that I think we need to be seeing more of It was wide-reaching, involving others, and enabling action at local scale to contribute to global challenges. So I'm going to be working through that theme today, really, with you. Just in terms of how I got to be here today, really, with you all. I started originally as a geographer. I did a geography degree. You can do practically anything with a geography degree, it seems. And then I trained as a paleoecologist, as Scott mentioned. And from there, I moved into conservation. And then I'm here with you today. So I'm going to be talking about a green recovery in Scotland. Green, in my book, being the colour of hope. So we'll just explore that. Scott mentioned that I'm Chief Officer of Scottish Environment Link. It's the network for environmental charities working in Scotland, both big and small. That's our 41 members there. So you can see that we range from the very small. So we've got organisations like FIDRA and Scottish Gardens Allotment Society, for example, up to the much, much bigger WWF and RSPB, for example. And they work in areas of work in the environment that go from species conservation to active travel, marine issues and planning on land and at sea. Between them, they've got more than 500,000 members that support their work. But we all work together to be the voice for Scotland's environment, particularly in policy circles. And we're all working together towards our objectives of a sustainable Scotland, where our environment is restored, resilient and connected, and where society and well-being have nature at their heart to benefit people, communities and the planet. So that's where we all come from and why we all work together. You can find out more about some of the examples of our work in a recently published publication that's available on our website called Still Delivering the Goods Report. And this showcases 15 of our members' current, past and future projects. You can see some of them there on the map. And then, of course, there's always more information on our website as well. But that's a good place to start if you just want to find out a little bit more about the variety of work that all of our members do together. So here we all are on planet Earth, the blue marble. And from this scale, Scotland is a tiny speck. But in fact, Scotland's got a role that's much larger than our geography implies. In the 1700s, Scotland was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, when today's relentless rise in carbon dioxide levels began. And then in the 1950s, the UK began a drive to become self-sufficient in food that we could grow in this country, with the start of mechanised farming and large-scale production methods, and the acceleration in biodiversity loss that's reached a crisis point today. So having played a significant role in both crises, both globally and at home, it's only right that we should be at the forefront of tackling both of them. And here in Scotland, it would be fair to say that we've recognised we have this role. There's recognition at the highest level of government in Scotland that both climate change and nature loss are existential crises for Scotland, and that we need to be leading the way. And you can see a quote there from the First Minister in a letter to us in 2019, when we'd written to ask her specifically about her priorities for nature and climate. So we are seeing political commitment and progress towards the 2045 target on climate change in Scotland, albeit with a few bumps in the road. What we're not seeing though yet is the same level of commitment to nature loss. And we need to change that if we're going to make progress on both of these crises together. Of course, we all know we're facing world-changing challenges. We've got the climate emergency, the nature emergency, and the global pandemic. We're in fact suffering human disease on a scale not seen since 1918 and the Spanish flu outbreak. Then on top of that, we've got the climate emergency with global temperatures rising at unprecedented rates and severely impacting on communities and natural habitats, both on land and at sea. At the same time, we're in a nature emergency where the rate of species extinctions is rising exponentially and is actually characterising the new geological period, the Anthropocene, where global changes are for the first time being driven by human activity. And while we can't solve all three of those emergencies at once, one thing we mustn't do is solve one while making the other two worse. But they're big challenges. We need to act, but if we're going to be effective, we need to act together. In terms of the climate emergency, I'm not going to say very much about this one because you all know the issues much better than me. So I'm not going to repeat them. The Scottish Government is, however, beginning to make the links between climate and nature, not so much between nature and disease, not yet anyway. And you can see this quote from Rosanna Cunningham, Cabinet Secretary for the Environment in 2019, and the recognition of Scotland's role in tackling them. I'll just give you a bit of time to read that. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to place this emergency right alongside the other two and look a little bit at nature and the pandemic as well. So if we look at the nature crisis, the loss of species was reported once, but most recently perhaps, in the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That doesn't roll off the tongue. They did a global assessment published in 2019 that showed that 1 million species across the world are threatened by extinction. And they identified that this is being driven by 5 direct drivers of change, which in descending order, so the most impactful at the top, changes in land and sea use. Then we have direct exploitation of organisms, and then we have climate change, followed by pollution and invasive non-native species. There's a whole bunch of statistics in this report, and I've put the link there so you'd be able to look it up at a later stage. But just to give you a flavour of some of those statistics, 3/4 of land-based environment and about 2/3 of the marine environment have been significantly altered by human actions. More than 1/3 of the world's land surface and nearly 75% of freshwater resources are now devoted to crop or livestock production. And the value of agricultural crop production has increased by about 300% since 1970. In 2015, 33 of marine fish stocks were being harvested at unsustainable levels, and urban areas have more than doubled since 1992. Plastic pollution has increased tenfold since 1980. What the report goes on to say is that the negative trends in nature will continue to 2050 and beyond in all of the policy scenarios explored, except for those that include transformative change. So there we have it, the need for transformative change. The quote that I've put there on the slide is from the IPBES chair, Sir Robert Watson. And he continued to say, the report also tells us that it is not too late to make a difference, but only if we start now at every level, from global to local. Through transformative change, nature can still be conserved, restored, and used sustainably. And this is also the key to meeting most other global goals. So if we look at the third challenge then, the pandemic, the nature crisis and the global pandemic are very closely linked. The COVID-19 pandemic has reached us as a result of close contact with wild species, and it's a direct outcome of today's nature crisis. In fact, almost all known pandemics, from HIV/AIDS to SARS and COVID-19, are caused by microbes from animals, and the frequency of new diseases emerging in human population is now increasing. The reservoir of currently undiscovered viruses thought to exist in mammals and birds is massive. It's about 1.7 million, 48% of which could have the ability to infect humans. So we can see this isn't going to be the last pandemic that's going to come to us from broken natural systems. And we're not immune here in Scotland. Studies show that since 2008, infection rates of Lyme's disease are rising across the UK, but especially in Scotland. Lyme's disease, of course, is transferred from ticks to humans in other ways as well, but that's the most frequent cause of transmission. Scientists say that it's highly likely that the abundance of ticks in our outdoor environments is associated with the rise in deer numbers over the past 50 years. And that in turn may have contributed to increasing incidences of Lyme's disease. So it illustrates that the increasing contact between humans and wild deer is leading to an increase in disease. I mentioned the links between nature and pandemics, and again, IPBES have done another report, this time in 2020, and this report came out of a workshop. The quote that I've put there is from Dr. Peter Daszak, and he's president of the EcoHealth Alliance and chaired this particular workshop. Again, I'll just give you a bit of time to read that quote. He goes on to say, pandemic risk can be significantly lowered by reducing human activities that drive the loss of biodiversity, by greater conservation of protected areas, and through measures that reduce unsustainable exploitation of high biodiversity regions. This will reduce wildlife, livestock, human contact, and help prevent the spillover of new diseases. The overwhelming scientific evidence points to a very positive conclusion. We have the increasing ability to prevent pandemics, but the way we're tackling them right now largely ignores that ability. Our approach has effectively stagnated. We still rely on attempts to contain and control diseases after they emerge through things like vaccines. We can escape the era of pandemics, but this requires a much greater focus on prevention in addition to reaction. So I've just summarised there 3 of the massive, huge global challenges that we're facing: climate change and the unstable climate, living with extremes and the spread of pandemics, nature loss, broken ecosystems, species extinction and habitat loss, and the start of pandemics. And then we also have the challenge of a lack of political and public will. There is a tendency to think we can solve it tomorrow, or someone else might do it, or that it's not that urgent. But a green recovery, in fact, needs transformative change in all of these and within the next 10 years. So how do we do it? Nature and climate emergencies mean we need to tackle both. We can't just do one and then the other. So it means that solutions for one mustn't make the other one worse. And there is actually potential for this. So for example, where biofuel production replaces food production or natural habitats, or where trees are planted in the wrong place. They're both potential solutions to climate change, but they make the nature crisis worse. However, there are other solutions, often called nature-based solutions to climate change, that tackle both. There's nature-friendly farming, there's protecting marine habitats, things like kelp forests, there's natural regeneration of woodland, there's peatland restoration, there's better soil management. So there's a whole armoury of different approaches that we could and should be taking. So how are we getting on? This is just a selection of progress that's being made today, and this is just purely from my opinion based on my own observations. So it's very far from complete and very far from scientific. It's just a snapshot really of things that I happen to think about. So in terms of climate action, we've updated the climate change plan. That's good. We are making progress towards the 2045 targets. Globally, we're not moving fast enough. And of course, there's the argument that we could and should be doing more in Scotland. Nature action, we've missed the HE biodiversity targets. Those are global targets that the world set as part of the COP process. We missed them in 2010, we missed them in 2020. We can't afford to miss them in 2030. But unlike climate in Scotland, we don't have any agreed targets for nature. We're effectively making it up as we go along, and we're each doing our own little bit, but the sum of the parts isn't really adding up to a whole, at least not one with a W. In terms of political and public will, I think we do have public will there. We've got a louder public voice calling for transformative change, but we're not managing to break through because we're not yet seeing the political will. And that, I think, is lagging behind. So I mentioned that I would tell you about some of the tactics that we're adopting at Scottish Environment Link, and I'm going to go through 3 of them really, and they all basically are focused around diversity. There's diversity in strength of numbers, there's diversity in cooperation, and then there's the diversity of action in time and space. So let's go through those. Diversity and strength, there's the obvious point that numbers matter. The more people that talk about this, the louder the voice for the environment is. But then targets matter too. We need to have something to aim for, and we need something to measure progress against. But targets are hard. They give us, just ordinary people, a measure of progress so we can see when governments, industry and society is not doing enough. But we can and should be using targets to monitor progress and point out where it falls short. And that, I think, has been one of the measures of success of the action for climate, and it's one that we'd like to see replicated in action for the nature crisis too. Cooperation matters too. This is all too big for government, it's too big for business, it's too big for society on their own. So we need to work together. Today, sometimes it feels as though there's too many people, silos, shouting at each other while the crises continue. But there are solutions, and this is a great example of working together. It's the sort of thing that I mean. This is Sunnyside Primary School presenting their posters on plastic waste in the marine environment to the Environment Minister, who's in the middle there, supported by our members and by SEPA, the Government Agency on Environmental Protection. But there are two barriers really facing those who are trying to make progress together. There's incremental change, and then there's competing priorities. So if we look at incremental change, the change in nature loss is largely incremental, which means that as we lose things, we just don't notice necessarily. And we all start to suffer from what's been called shifting baseline syndrome, which is exacerbated by another long term, the nature deficit disorder, where fewer children are coming into regular contact with nature and the outdoors across the UK. Even by the 1970s, which incidentally is when we started to collect decent data on nature trends, the changes had set in, and since then, they've accelerated. So if we were to ask parents, grandparents what they used to do when they were small, how many went fishing for sticklebacks, for example, or shrimps? How many collected bunches of wild flowers? How many collected berries to make jams or pies? And how many of us still do that? I think if you drew a graph of that kind of engagement, I think it would show a pretty steep decline. The National Trust in England produced a report in 2012 called the Natural Childhood Report. And that found that fewer than a quarter of children regularly used their local patch for nature, compared to over half of adults when they were children. Fewer than 1 in 10 children regularly play in wild places, compared to almost half a generation ago. And children spend so little time outdoors that they're unfamiliar with some of our commonest wild creatures. According to another National Trust survey in 2008, 1 in 3 couldn't identify a magpie, half couldn't tell the difference between a bee and a wasp, but 9 out of 10 recognised a Dalek. Competing priorities are also actually a barrier. Climate change and nature loss are both important and urgent, but they both suffer from the Eisenhower principle. And I've just put a little quote there for you about the Eisenhower principle. So we need somehow to turn them from urgent into important just to get them up the to-do lists, particularly for the next Parliament. I keep mentioning the next 10 years, that's 2 parliamentary terms. That's why it's so important. What the Eisenhower principle means, though, is that these issues never reach the top of the to-do list. There's always something more urgent. There's a financial crash, or there's a referendum, or there's a global pandemic. Ironically, brought about as a direct result of the fact we've ignored the needs of the environment for too long. The solutions to these urgent actions, however, are largely political reactions focused on the immediate. They don't address ecological certainties. And while the ecological certainty continues to degrade, political solutions keep generating themselves and taking a time and effort that should be looking at these ecological crises. That brings me on to the final tactic, diversity of action in time and space. I've said a lot, I think, that planetary emergencies require local solutions. And the pressure for change to incremental problems like these isn't going to come from politicians. It's going to come from communities. And Margaret Atwood put it really well in this little quote here on the slide. A parliamentary term of 5 years is too short, and there are too many dependencies and consequences for politicians to be able to act on a much longer term basis. But today's nature and climate emergencies do need to be solved in the next 10 years. By the time politicians start to act 10 years from now, it will arguably be too late. And that's why change for these types of emergencies come from grassroots communities, because they see beyond the next 5 years. This is an example, the little sketch that I've got on the slide here. The kelp industry meets global demand for alginates, which are used in foods, textiles, and pharmaceuticals. In 2018, Ullapool Sea Savers started a #NoKelpDredge campaign to halt mechanical kelp dredging along the west coast of Scotland. They worked with parliamentarians, celebrities, some of our members, and watched the Crown Estate Bill voted through the Scottish Parliament to prevent mechanical kelp extraction. That's just one example of saving today's nature for tomorrow's future using local solutions to meet global changes. One thing we need to do, though, is make sure that politicians know this is important to us. It's really clear at the moment in the run-up to the election that politicians think we're only worried about today's economy, today's health and today's education. All you need to do is look at the literature that keeps pouring through the letterboxes. We are worried about that, of course, but we're also worried about tomorrow's economy, tomorrow's health and tomorrow's education. And none of those can thrive if the environment can no longer support what we need. So before I talk about what we can do, I just want to explore some of the things we need. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it does relate back to those issues I mentioned of the environment, the economy, and our health. I keep banging on about nature targets. So this is the final one, honestly. If we have nature targets, we can measure progress. In 2019, you can see the report here that we published called The State of Nature of Scotland. It showed that 1 in 9 of Scotland's species are in danger of extinction. 49% of Scottish species have decreased since the 70s. Remember, that was when we started collecting decent data. And nature is changing rapidly, with 62% of species showing strong changes. Of the 6,500 species found in Scotland that have been assessed, 11% have been classified as threatened with extinction. And the drivers of change in Scotland are not that different to those drivers of change that IPBES noticed on a global scale. It's land management changes, hydrological changes, pollution, invasive non-native species, climate change, marine issues, and fisheries. It's not just about targets in Scotland, though. We also need global ones. And this is where we're looking towards the Biodiversity COP15 in Kunming in October, the month before, or probably only about 2 weeks before COP26 in Glasgow. And we're working with our sister link organisations in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And we're calling for a commitment to halt the loss of biodiversity by 2030 and recovery by 2050. That COP's going to be really important to see that commitment come forward, we hope. The other thing we need to see is resilient ecosystems on land and at sea. Protected areas are the refuge for many of our rare and our not so rare species. And it's from these refuges that they can spread when conditions are right or when their current habitat changes so they can't actually stay. That means protected areas need to be flexible enough to build resilience into habitats and amongst species populations, and protected to prevent further fragmentation. They also need to be properly protected. They can't be paper parks. And what I mean by that is one example of the marine protected areas that are in place in Scotland at the moment. 37% of Scotland's sea area is under marine protected area status, but our members estimate that only 1% of that is properly protected, fully protected from damaging activities. That just illustrates the point, really. We also need nature networks. If species and habitats are going to be able to move, they need a porous landscape that they can move through. And part of this is nature networks. We've made a short film on our website that explains what nature networks are and why we need them. So I won't go into that anymore now, but it's worth a watch if you have time. The economy, I said I'd mention the economy. A circular economy means living within planetary limits. It means reusing materials as much and as often as we can, reducing demand for raw materials and only recycling as a last resort. We have a circular economy project running within Link, and a key part of that project is to get a circular economy bill through Parliament to start to address those issues. And then finally, health. This is health, physical and mental health amongst communities, but also access to a healthy environment. So it's both human and environmental health. We want to see 20-minute neighbourhoods, and these are where everyone living in Scotland has access to a healthy green space. By that I mean ecologically functional, I don't just mean a bit of grass, within 20 minutes active travel from their home. And for active travel itself, we need an infrastructure to support that throughout Scotland, so cycle paths and long distance footpaths, for example. But then on top of that, we also need to build confidence and skills to access the outdoors. And the picture you see there is an example of one of our member projects run by Ramblers Scotland called the Out There Award. which they started just before the pandemic and then managed to keep going through the pandemic with, that gives young people support and confidence to be able to go out and explore the outdoors on their own or in small groups. So the obvious thing that we can all do, obviously, is to vote. So I don't really need to say anything more about that. But we can also sign up to campaigns to demonstrate our support on key issues. And this is just an example of 2 that we're running at the moment in Link. One is for individuals to sign up to, so that the constituents that are standing in their area know that they, the individuals, support Action for Nature. And that's the bottom one with the otter. And then we've got another one on top of that that runs alongside in parallel to encourage all of the current candidates for today, their Holyrood election, to pledge for nature in the next Parliament. These are both on our website, but one thing I would say is that if you could sign up to the first one, the ones individuals, then that would be great. Particularly, you'll notice the numbers in Glasgow and central Scotland are very low. So if you live there, it would be great if you could just help us bump those numbers up a little bit. Then there's the wider issue, of course. Those are both about pledging for nature, pledging support for nature, but we're also involved in another campaign run by ourselves and some of our members with other organisations, including SCVO and others, that uses social media called Oh Future. Sorry, I can't pronounce that very well. And it's letting candidates know that we are all connected to the planet and with each other, and this is a concern going forward into the future. I've just got a couple of tweets that have come out recently on this, just to show you the sort of thing that's coming up as part of this campaign. It's all about boots and footprints. It's great. Of course, the importance of talking to each other and spreading the word absolutely cannot be restated. And this is Ullapool Sea Savers again. They're a really excellent example of this approach. They work together, they highlight local and global issues, and then they bring others on board, either by inspiring them and sometimes by shaming them to act. And it works really, really well. So that's just one example, really, of the sort of thing I mean. In terms of government, obviously government can do a lot through legislation that protects and enhances, that builds in, guides and enforces change. In the last Parliament, these are just some of the examples of the successes that Cabinet Secretary had in marine issues. There is so much more to do though, and we need to see an even better record than this in the next 2 Parliaments from all Cabinet Secretaries, and not just the Environment and Climate Change one. So what I'm going to end with is some inspiring pictures and stories, really, that keep me going, that get me up in the morning and keep plugging away, even when it doesn't feel as though we're getting anywhere. So I'll just let you watch these for a bit. So thank you. I'm going to shut up there. I hope there's something in there that's been useful for you as you go into your workshop. You can find out more about the work that Scottish Environment Link does and our members through our website, obviously. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that I was going to try and show you a film, but my laptop just isn't up to it, I've discovered. But I'll put a link into the chat for a film that we commissioned from Mara Media. And those of you that have seen Stormbound and Islands on the Edge on TV will recognise some of the footage in it, I think. But it's just a really inspiring film about Scotland's nature and why we need to do more. It was aimed originally, well, it is aimed at funders to try and raise more money to help everyone conserve the environment, but the message is relevant to us all. So I'll put that link in the chat, and then you can watch it whenever you have time. I'll put the sound on, but not too loud, because it's a brilliant soundtrack, but it can blow your head off if it's too loud. That's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deborah. So, folks, we are going to go on to a Q&A just now. Yeah, really, thank you so much for that, Deborah. I think it was really eye-opening. I'm sure many of us will agree, especially hearing about your work with Scottish Link and also getting an idea of the scale and quantity of challenges ahead of us to ensure green recovery, and what we can do to get involved in that. I'm still a bit shocked personally, and obviously it's a small fact that came out of your presentation, but about, you know, some children not being able to differentiate between a bee and a wasp, but recognizing a Dalek. That to me, for some reason, is especially surprising. So yeah, as I said, we'll move on to the Q&A now, but I do want to just preface this very briefly by saying we may not be able to get through every question that I guess asked just now. However, we will try to strive and do our best to, at least to tackle the main themes coming out of the questions. So it's purely just based on trying to make sure we stay on time as much as anything. So let's, I think everyone should maybe have had enough time to submit some questions. So what I'll do is I'll stop my screen share just now, and I will have a look just now at the questions that have come in. And as you've seen, Deborah's just posted the link to that video. Okay, so yeah, we have some questions here then from the attendees today from Menti. So Deborah, I'm going to read the question through to you, and basically, yeah, get your thoughts on as many of these as we can within reason. I hope that sounds good with you.
That's fine, as long as they're easy ones.
Yeah, we'll try our best. We'll try our best. So, starting off then, a question about COP26. I think it was certain that that was going to be brought up, given, you know, Scotland's unique position with it this year. So, how important do you think COP26 is for Scotland when it comes to the green recovery? You know, what do you think is the biggest opportunity for Scotland coming out of that?
I was just checking I was unmuted then. I think it's crucial. It's crucial because it brings the eye of the world to Scotland. So that's one aspect, but it's also crucial because Scotland and Scotland's politicians like to be seen to be leading. I always say they're a little bit like a Labrador. They always want to be out in front. The COP26 is an excellent example for us as a country to make sure that we are saying the right things, but also doing the right things. And although we often hear good messages, we don't always see the action that matches up to that. So although COP26 is really important to make sure that we hear the right messages coming out from the Scottish Government and the UK Government, even more important is the action behind that. About 10 years ago, Scottish Environment Link, before I was involved, produced a report called From Rhetoric to Reality. And that identified even 10 years ago that the words were good, but the actions didn't always match up. We're going to redo that report again. We're going to do a second version this summer because we think we've still got, and some people think it's got even worse, we've still got the issue between what's said and then what's done. So COP26 is really important because it opens up that conversation, but what comes afterwards is even more important, I think.
Yeah, and I think that to a degree comes back to what you said about, you know, what's important and what's urgent as well, that you touched on earlier. So yeah, awesome. So the next question then is, do you think there is anything about the pandemic that supported the climate? Has it brought any benefits?
Well, I suppose the obvious one, you know, is the fact that people weren't traveling. So you know, emissions went down in that respect anyway. In Link, we look at our carbon emissions, and we have carbon budgets every year. And one of our KPIs is to make sure that that goes down year on year. I've got a board meeting next week, and obviously next year we're not going to be able to go lower than this year because we've not been travelling for work, we've not been travelling to the office. So that's the obvious thing that we can see, that emissions have gone down because people are staying at home. I think, well, that's the most obvious one really that I can see. If it makes people think about how we react with the planet, then I think that's better. There's a lot of reports about how people are noticing the birds in their garden more. They're coming more into contact with nature, whether that's, you know, in the local park, or whether it's even just, you know, with a window box or whatever it is. People are much more aware of nature, and being in nature is helping people feel a bit better about the whole situation. So that's another benefit that's come out. The trick, I think, is going to be making sure that we don't forget about all those benefits and we try and go back to business as usual, because business as usual is just not going to work. So that's where I think this election is going to be so important, that we need to see that whoever comes in has to really mean not to go back to business as usual. And I am a bit concerned that in some areas we might well look at that. So farming, for instance, is one area where we really need to see step changes there, and we're not really seeing the mechanics of that in place yet.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, even if going back to what you said about people seeing more nature in their around their homes and around where they live, if more kids can be able to identify magpie, as you mentioned before, I think that would be you know, a small step in the right direction, obviously from kind of a very local perspective. So so moving on to our third question then. This person says, thank you for a really interesting talk, Deborah, and I absolutely echo that. You mentioned enshrining nature targets in law similar to current climate targets. They'd be interested to hear more about what form you'd expect those to take and what commitments they should target.
That's a really good question, because it's actually really difficult. So I just gracefully skated over that. Nature targets aren't easy because it's just such a broad and complicated procedure. So we have lots of discussions within LINC, and the one I gave you on that slide is the result of months and months of discussion. So it's very high level. If we get sign up to that, then I think we're going to be doing really well, because then that enables us to look at what we're actually going to be doing in order to halt the decline in biodiversity and then to reverse it going forward. Because what we need to do is, it's not just a straightforward action that one group of people can do in one place. It's a whole host of actions that need to happen across the way we use our land, the way we use sea, and the way we live our lives. So having targets that, for example, encourage natural woodland regeneration. There's a lot of talk about tree planting at the moment, less so about natural woodland regeneration. So that's one. Let's have more native woodland regeneration and native woodland planting. If you're going to do that successfully, you need to tackle the deer problem. So we need to have targets on deer numbers and how they interact in the landscape. So that's another one. There's a lot of funding and support going into peatland restoration peatland restoration projects at the moment. So having targets for that is obviously a good thing. Halting the loss of peat use in horticulture. That's come up in one of the manifestos at least. So that's another good one. I mean, they're not all directly linked to nature, but if you halt the use of peat in gardening, then that means you're no longer digging up peat bogs, which can then sequester carbon and become, you know, a fully functioning ecosystem. If you look at marine, there's, I think, targets on protecting habitats that both store carbon and act as nursery sites for fish populations, for example. So I'm thinking of things like kelp forests along the coast. They do both of those things, and they also protect coastal communities from storms. So that would be a good nature target. Halting the destruction of cold water corals would be another one. You know, cold water corals store a lot of carbon, great habitat. That would be another. I mean, there's a whole host of stuff, but you can see that there's no one single simple target. We need a whole host of them that build in together to that very generic and kind of bland one that I put on the screen, to halt the loss and then see a recovery in biodiversity. So it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I know you said at the beginning easy questions only, but I think you answered that one really well. Especially, I think for most people, kind of grasping the just the scale of all these different targets that need to be pulled together is in itself quite a challenge. So I think you summed up really well there, actually. Our next question then, and you touched on it before, obviously, with some of the actions people can take, but this person asks, what do you think is the key, most impactful action, in your opinion, someone can take to help Scotland achieve a green recovery? So how can we as individuals make an impact?
In the next couple of weeks, I think it is really thinking about, what the candidates for Holyrood are saying, and then once they get, well, if they get in, making sure that they are held to that. So one campaign that we've been running recently was called Species Champions with MSPs in Holyrood. And what that did was it enabled them to find out about species. I mean, really basic stuff often, but not always. That then inspired an interest in them to go and talk to their constituents. They were going into schools to talk about bats, for example, or about pond snails, or about adders, whatever it was, they were interacting with their constituents. And it also engendered a bit of a healthy competition. So they were, doing a bit of one-upmanship in the debates about who was species champions for this and who was species champions for that. It was great to see. So, but keeping them, keeping their feet to the fire on that sort of issue, I think is going to be the most impactful. And because we've only got such a short time, we really need to see impact coming through in the next parliamentary term. So as individuals, I think that is the most impactful thing we can do. We can make sure that politicians are delivering on what they said they're going to deliver within the next 5 years. We can also deliver the vision, like I showed you for Ullapool Sea Savers. It's hard sometimes for politicians to see beyond the next 5 years, and it's hard for them to act if they think that they're going to get a massive, rebound on it. So one thing that we're really keen to do is to demonstrate there's public support out there. We're creating space for them to make the right decisions for the environment, which inevitably are going to go against vested interests. Deer management is a really good example of that, actually, but there are lots of examples. That's just one. So, but they need that space in order to act. So I think as individuals, particularly you guys and our members as well, making sure that politicians feel they have that space and then act in it, but maintain the momentum is absolutely key. It's a bit of a boring answer, to be honest, but I just think it's so urgent now. That's probably the best place to put our energies.
Yeah, I know. I think it's an important point to make, and tangentially related to that, I have a feeling you may come up with a similar answer here. But another person has asked, how do you recommend we encourage others, friends, family, colleagues, to take action?
I think there's a lot, just in talking and doing. So a classic example of that is, well, the Sea Savers ones that I showed you, but even locally, when I moved into our house, we had a bit of ground right outside our house that was just full of, it was just full of stuff that happened to be growing there. It wasn't particularly pretty and it wasn't great for wildlife. It was all just, coarse grasses and things. And we cleared it and made it much more friendly for wildlife, but it also looked much better. And then that kind of, sparked off a whole chain of reactions right along the street. And I think even that, if we change our local environment and then talk to people as we're doing it, I think that then inspires others. So it's about inspiring others to act through what you're doing and what you're talking about, I think. And you guys are in an absolutely perfect position to do that. So I think inspire and just talk about it loads.
And that's in a way what the 2050 Climate Group are here to assist with as well. So
excellent.
Okay, so I'm just noting the time. I think we're only going to be able to squeeze one question in. So apologies, folks, if we haven't been able to tackle your question. We had quite a number of them, which was really heartening to see. But we'll finish on this one if that's okay. You noted we could and should be doing more in Scotland. What do you feel are the key opportunities where Scotland should be doing more?
One of the key opportunities, I think, is that Scotland kind of sells itself as on its natural environment and it being a healthy environment. And although that's true, I think we could be doing much more to ensure that that environment is healthy going forward. So when you see, you know, adverts that Visit Scotland do, for example, it's always about, you know, the mountains, the eagles. It plays on our natural environment. And given that we've got that kind of reputation around the world, I think we should be doing much, much more with that. And walking the green walk as well, you know, it comes back to, it shouldn't just be a show. It needs to go much, much deeper into policy and society. So I think that's the biggest opportunity that we have here in Scotland. We've got this fantastic reputation, and COP26 is when we're going to see a heck of a lot more of it, I think. We just need to make sure that the action follows that up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're in a really unique position in Scotland to have such reputation when, you know, a lot of, at least the Western world potentially doesn't. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. And obviously with COP26 coming up, yeah, I agree. It'll be interesting to see what does follow in terms of action, or if it'll just be kind of parading in a way of what Scotland's about. So fingers crossed. Okay, I think that's as much time as we have for the Q&A. Some quite difficult questions there, Deborah, so thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming today and giving us your keynote. It was really inspiring, and I actually in particular like just looking at the pictures that you showed at the end. I think that's a really unique way of kind of ending it. So yeah, thank you so much.
So we'll now move on. We're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Jan Maskell joining us today. Just before our break, Deborah highlighted the importance of spreading the word and cooperation in environmental action, as well as inspiring others. Jan is going to explore the importance of values when communicating and cooperating. Do you want to give us a quick wave, Jan? Hello.
Afternoon, everybody.
So Jan works with individuals as a coach and with teams and groups facilitating development and change. She's a registered occupational psychologist with over 20 years experience of working with public, private and not-for-profit organisations with a focus on management and leadership. She's an education director for Scientists for Global Responsibility, a research and campaign organisation that promotes responsible science and technology, where she is responsible for their education output and resources and delivers workshops in schools on carbon footprinting. She applies her knowledge and experience of positive psychology, has a passion for learning, and promotes the role of psychology in behaviour change at a personal and organisational level. She helps organisations to implement environmental management systems, reduce their resource consumption, and engage employees in reaching net zero. So in her session today, Jan will run through the Schwartz Basic Values Model. I really hope I'm saying that. You can correct me if not, Jan. Which was shared with you in the event programme, but don't worry about trying to find that at the moment because we'll share it with you again in the chat. After her presentation, we'll also be heading into breakout rooms to work on the exercise she's prepared for us. If you're not in an environment where you're able to join in on your group's discussion, then that's absolutely fine. Please do not feel responsibility to get involved, but of course it would be fantastic if you could get involved. And don't be shy if you've got kids or dogs or whatever nonsense going on in the background. It happens to all of us and we're very much used to it on Zoom. I think we're going to use a system, a new system to us. So if you are in a position where you're not sure if you want to participate, then we're going to ask you to rename yourself again and add an exclamation mark at the start of your name. So I'll just give you a quick example of what I mean by that. Just take your name and add an exclamation point at the start. And this will make it a bit easier for us to facilitate the breakout rooms. So I'll just give you like 10 seconds or so to do that if you need to do that. Okay, great. If you need a hand adding an exclamation point to your name, then we can send instructions into the chat box. But without further ado, we'll give a huge virtual round of applause to Jan.
Right. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you for all of that information. That's really great. let me just say, I'm just interested to see the photograph that I always send people to use. And then I look at myself and I think of all the lockdown hair that I've got. So let me just start to share my slides. Thank you for that introduction. That was really interesting. Yeah, what a lot of stuff I do. Let me find that's it. Okay, so yeah, two of the key things that I think qualify me to be able to speak to you this morning about this issue of using values to communicate. One is that I'm a chartered psychologist. I'm an occupational psychologist. I'm not clinical, I'm not forensic, I'm not educational. I look at what motivates people at work, look at behaviour change in work, and particularly concentrating on pro-environmental behaviour change. So a lot of the work I do working with organisations is looking at behaviour change interventions and how we can encourage more pro-environmental behaviour at work. And a lot of that is about communication. So being a psychologist, I think, enables me to look at things from a human perspective. But I've put my qualifications down there as well. The doctor bit is, I've got a doctorate in educational research. I'm also a member of the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, which is about HR. I like the PIEMA bit. It's nothing to do with pies. It's a practitioner member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and I'm a senior fellow of the Higher Education Authority. Now, there's a reason why I've put all those qualifications in there, which will come through in the bit of presentation I'm going to do. So the structure of this session, I really encourage you to participate in the breakout session. It's going to be a really safe environment and potentially a bit of fun. So hopefully if you've put an exclamation mark in front of your name, you might choose to take it away and join in the exercise, but no pressure. This session is going to take just over an hour or so. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction about some of the issues and how I'd like you to participate in that exercise, then give you a bit of time for the exercise, and then ideally you come back into the main room and we can have a discussion about how that went, what you learned, what was fun, what wasn't fun. And then I'll finish up with a little bit more information at the end. So that's kind of the structure of what we're doing here. So using values to communicate, what do we mean by values? Because it's the sort of thing that people talk about and say, oh, yeah, talk about values, but do they really know what they mean in terms of our own personal values? So we're going to look at this model that Ava mentioned, the Schwartz basic, you don't have to say the Schwartz bit, you can just say basic human values. There is a copy of that which you can access, and you will need that for the exercise that you're going to do. But I'm going to unpick some of that so you'll be a little bit more familiar with it when you actually come to use it. So we'll also look at why are values important when we communicate. And we're going to look at communicating about climate. And this is where, if we can understand our own values, what's important to us. So when it was interesting when Deborah was talking about the Eisenhower model of important and urgent, do we know what's most important to us as individuals? And can we identify what might be most important to other people? And that can help us when we're trying to communicate things. And this is how we can use values to communicate more effectively. So we'll have a look at that. So let's start off by looking at what we mean by values. And I've chosen the picture of the compass here because often people talk about their true north. What are the things that guide me? What are the things that are most important to me? What are the things that I value most in my life? So values, these represent our guiding principles. We talk about our broadest motivations, the things that drive us to do what we do. And they do influence the attitudes we hold and how we act. And if we find ourselves acting in ways that are not congruent with our values, we experience something called cognitive dissonance, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. So our values, when we're working and acting and behaving in line with our values, then we don't experience that cognitive dissonance. And those values influence lots of things. We influence our political persuasions. Deborah and Scott mentioned about voting. I'm not going to talk about political persuasions, but it's very obvious that what people think things are important will influence the way that they vote. And also our willingness to participate in what might be described as political action. And I think some of the things that Deborah was talking about were very political actions, about bringing people together, about encouraging people and organisations to think about differently. Some people may participate in more activist political actions, but that will always be driven by what's important to you. Our career choices should be driven by our values. If we find ourselves in a job and it's not aligned to our values, when we're doing a role which contradicts our values, or at least doesn't enable us to implement those, that can feel really, really uncomfortable. I know there are certain organisations that I will not work with. I will choose not to work with them. And sometimes that puts me in a difficult position in some of the organisations I work with. And I have to say, actually, I'm not going to do that. That's my choice. Our values will influence our ecological footprints, so how big our footprint is, and the amount of resources we use and for what purpose. So I like to think that I have a fairly light footprint, that I use as few resources as possible, and that every decision that I make is framed with an environmental sustainability lens. And all of that influences our feelings of well-being. So if I'm acting in a way that is in line with my values, then that will increase my psychological well-being. So all these things are tied up together. So this is the model of Schwartz's basic human values. Now this was developed through quite a lot of research that was done into what people think is important. So this model, and we're going to look at this model in a couple of different ways. This is like the big picture looking back at it. And if we look at the outside of the wheel, you can see there's 4 areas identified there. Self-transcendence, conservation and self-enhancement and openness to change. Well, we can look at these as almost diametrically opposed. So if we just look at self-transcendence and self-enhancement, you might think, what on earth do those words mean? Well, self-transcendence is going beyond us as individuals, so thinking outside of our own needs and wants. And self-enhancement is much more inward-looking in terms of what's important to me, what I want to do, what I want to achieve. And you can see that the opposites may apply again to openness to change. So how open or willing are people to change? Or how much do people want things to stay as they are? And I'm thinking about an event that's happening this afternoon, which some people, like my mother-in-law, will be very keen to watch on the television for a good couple of hours, because she fits into that quadrant down there, and she will be watching the television and waving her flag. I will be going up the allotment this afternoon. So that's how I'm going to mark the passing of Prince Philip. So there's a little bit more disclosure about me. So let's look at this a little bit more. Look at the self-transcendence versus self-enhancement bit. But this summarises all of the 10 items that we looked at in that big circle model. So universalism comes under self-transcendence. Sorry, yes, self-transcendence. Understanding, appreciation, tolerance and protection for the welfare of all people and for nature. So a lot of what Deborah was talking about this morning, I think, chimes with this value. So, but it's not just about people, it's all people. So it's very inclusive, and nature. So it's not just for humans, it's for plants and animals as well, all animals as well. Benevolence, preservation, enhancement of the welfare of people with whom one is in frequent personal contact. So that is rather than universalism, this is about behaving benevolently towards other people. Tradition. This is about respect, commitment and acceptance of the customs and ideas that traditional culture or religion provide the self. So you could spend a long time discussing what is traditional culture and what is traditional religion, and that will be different for different people. But for some people, those traditions, rites, rituals are really, really important. Conformity, restraint of actions, inclinations and impulses likely to upset or harm others and violate social expectations or norms. It's a lovely way of expressing it. So that's about people's desire to conform what are socially expected norms or those social expectations. Some of us don't mind upsetting those social expectations. Security, the need for safety, harmony, stability of society, of relationships and of self. Some people need that safety and security. We've got power, social status, prestige, control, dominance over people. There are some people who crave that, that element of power. Achievement, personal success. Some people want that sense of achievement. Hedonism. I'm always intrigued by looking at this because for some people this is much, much more important than others. However, when you think about all of the values, there's probably a little bit of some of these that everybody wants. So hedonism, everyone wants a bit of pleasure. I'm making a generalisation there. There may be some people who don't. Stimulation, excitement, novelty, doing things different. And this is obviously moving into the openness to change. And self-direction. So I'm going to concentrate on two opposing sides of this quadrant just to explain it a bit more. So we're going to look at power and achievement. So power, that social status, control, dominance, achievement, personal success through demonstrating competence according to social standards. And at the opposite side of the circle, universalism. This is the understanding, appreciation, protection, welfare of all people and for nature, and benevolence, preservation, enhancement of the welfare of people for whom one is in frequent personal contact. So you can see where those power and achievement are diametrically opposed to universalism and benevolence. So we're going to look at another way of presenting Schwartz basic human values, which has got a lot more detail in it, and it's carved up into those different areas. So you've got the 10 aspects of the values, and each of those has anything from 3 to 10 items in it. Now, you might start to look at that and go, some of those look a bit funny. Some of those jump off the page at you and go, that's important to me. Others you may go, I mean, there are some on there which I think that has no relevance to me whatsoever. And this is where I contrast myself with my mother-in-law, I mentioned before. She has an obsession with clean, which is probably one of the reasons why I haven't gone down to see her this weekend, and because the opportunity to speak to you. She vacuums every single day, and she cleans the cat litter tray out every time it has a pee. Right. That to me is, just a little bit extreme. So I don't share that value with her, but I understand that that is important to her. And it's about understanding what is important, but also what it means and what the implications are of that. So you might be having a look at this and going, yeah, there are some in here I think I can subscribe to, some I might not. So let's have a look at this, the power and achievement bit. So I picked 3 out here, and ideally you should be able to look at all of the values listed on this diagram and say, I can identify maybe 3, 4 that are really, really important to me. And you could put them in a whole order of importance. But you can imagine that there are some people, particularly people in the public eye, who we might see, these are what we think their values are. So wealth, authority, and ambition. And it was interesting to think about politicians in relation to this. And I'm sure everyone can think of at least one politician who they think might have these values. And in previous years, when I've done this sort of exercise, people have immediately gone, Donald Trump. And I'm sure those are a lot of the things that were driving him. Certainly the power element and the achievement were high on his agenda. And if we contrast that with the universalism benevolent section, these are what I would say are my top 3 values. I've also got lots of others as well, but So unity with nature. So this is why I was, cheering along when Deborah was doing her session this morning, because I think nature is such an important part of our life, and we need to protect it, and we need to do so much with it. So I'm working with a lot of nature organisations through my local nature partnership, helping them to develop their own environmental management systems. Protecting the environment is really important to me, as is a world at peace. Now, it took me a while to realise how important these things were to me. I'll tell you that story. When my children, I have 2 children, used to say to me when they were smaller, "Mum, what can we get you for your birthday?" I used to say, an end to climate change and world peace. And that's before I'd even seen this model. And I'd say, yeah, and we can start at home. So start close to home. No one's too small to make a difference. So in terms of protecting the environment and tackling climate change, please can you remember to switch off your gadgets when you're not using them, and turn the lights off when you leave the room, and walk to school, and a world at peace. Can we begin that at home? And please can you two aim to get along more? So they thought that was quite amusing. So contrast me with the one we just looked at in terms of power. If I'm trying to communicate with someone who has those values, I can't use my values to communicate with them because they don't align. I need to think about what's important to them to be able to communicate with them effectively. And that's the part of the exercise I'm going to ask you to do in a few minutes. So that can be a bit of fun depending on who you choose to talk to. So, as I say, you might want to just have a look at this. You do have access to this. I believe there's a link in the chat to it, and you have been given the information about this document. So you can have a look at this and think about what values you have. And you might want to disclose some of that in your breakout room. But I am going to ask you to choose some values of someone you're going to decide will be your audience. So, in terms of the exercise, we're going to get you to talk about climate. Now, Stephen Covey wrote a very best-selling book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the things he said, which I think resonates quite a lot with communication, is most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Now, if you think about a conversation that you're having with someone, let's say someone's talking to you about their holidays, their holiday plans. Part of what's going on in your head will be, oh, what are my holiday plans? Oh, have I been to that place they've been to? So you're thinking about how you're going to reply from your own perspective, from your own experiences, rather than trying to find out as much as you can about what it is about that place that's important to them, why they've chosen to go there, what are their values in relation to that. So listening, try to practice listening with the intent to understand rather than with the intent to reply. And one of the things we need to do about this is to get onto someone else's hilltop. Now, if you think I'm the person on the left on my hilltop, that's me up there, person on the right is my brother. He is a couple of years younger than me. We grew up in the same household. We had lots of shared experiences in terms of our parents and our sibling. We both have a sister, same one. So in my family, the 3 children went to very similar schools. My sister and I went to a girls' grammar school. My brother went to the boys' equivalent of the grammar school. My brother and sister both went on to university. I could not wait to get out of the school system. So I left school at 16, went to work, and I have spent since then getting more qualifications. As you could see, that's why I mentioned those things at the start. It's been really important to me to recognize that I do actually have a love of learning. I just didn't have a love of the education system. So if I'm trying to communicate with my brother, who is a finance director for a big organization, I have to try and get onto his hilltop to see what's important to him to be able to communicate with him. So I can't say to him, I think you should stop flying. I think you should get rid of your gas guzzling car. I think you should stop eating meat. That's not going to work. I need to understand why maybe some of those things are important to him. So getting onto someone else's hilltop. We can only do that if we listen with the intent to understand. So the exercise I'm going to ask you to do in a few minutes, there's 4 aspects to this. So think about these 4 things. In your group, obviously when you go into the room, you might just want to say hi to people, say who you are, just a minute's introduction. Then I want you to, one of you in the group, to decide who it is you want to have a conversation with. So choose your audience. So it could be a cool teenager. Now, all teenagers are cool. We know that. It could be someone like a retired farmer. It could be your own parent or your sibling. So I could choose to speak to my brother or my mother-in-law. A conservative politician with a small or a large C, it's up to you. Struggling teenage parent, soldier, or a minion. It could be anyone at all. It might be someone that you think, yeah, I do want to have a conversation with someone, and I know who they are, and I could actually pinpoint what I think their values are. If you can't think of someone you actually want to speak to, then just choose someone. It could be something from this list. You might struggle with speaking to a minion, unless you can speak minion. Second is describe them. So just some of the features around them. So what do they look like? What gender are they? What age are they? How do they travel? Where do they live? Where do they go on holiday? What sorts of things are important to them? So just describe physical things about them. And then looking at the basic human values, what do you think are their 3 core values or their top 3 values? See if you can identify what you think those might be. And then it could be, this is my brother-in-law. You can have a conversation with my brother-in-law. He is a solicitor and works with a homeless charity. So he has a very strong value of social justice, but he also has a strong achievement value around being capable and being qualified and being up to date and having that credibility when he's appearing in court. He also has this very, very strong pleasure value. Any minute he is not at work, he will be spending it with friends, socializing. So I could have a conversation with my brother-in-law, but I would need to try and tap in to those values and to find out why he feels it necessary to fly to Spain 6 times a year and why he still eats meat. So I could use those values to try and have a conversation with him. So the 4th part is to practice a conversation. Now, there's 2 ways you could do this. One is you could actually choose to play out that conversation. So one person might be themselves, the other person could be my brother-in-law or whoever. Or you could just, as a group, think about what sort of questions you could choose to ask them and then see how that might play out. So rather than lecturing your partner about your views, you're asking them about what climate change means to them. So asking questions, but thinking about their values, so trying to align it with that. Ask about their personal experience. Reflect what you hear, show you've heard, don't interrupt them. Try and learn from them. So this exercise is around trying to find out from someone, and you decide who it might be. So you choose your audience, you describe them, think about what their values are, and practice a conversation. Now, I'd like to spend about 20 minutes doing that. So I don't think anyone's got any questions in relation to that. You're going to be put into a breakout room and I'll ask you to go through those 4 actions there. So I think the technical wizard is going to put people into breakout rooms. Is that right?
Yes, thank you so much, Jan.
Okay.
That was a really, really interesting introduction to our exercise. I don't think I've actually ever thought about values in that way before, so thank you for going through that. Yeah, so we'll now move into breakout rooms, and this will happen automatically. So if you haven't done this before, don't worry at all. It's all very seamless. We'll start with Scott, if you want to go first then. Let us know what your room was chatting about.
Yeah, sure. And Rebecca, please feel free to chime in because I think you're much more articulate about this than I was. But I incidentally took notes, so I have to be the person who feeds back. So apologies if this isn't entirely covering the brief. We were trying our best to think about this. But our audience, we initially thought about you know, how do you kind of have a conversation with Scottish Conservative MPs in the run up to the election? And then it kind of turned into a bit more generally, how do you actually talk to perhaps Conservative voters? And in describing them, we kind of thought, you know, what their main values are towards the bottom of the value sheet that you gave us earlier, Jan, more around tradition, achievement, power, security, that kind of thing. And in particular, core values potentially being things like respect for tradition and social order, and thinking about, you know, being successful and what that means to you as an individual and as your family, in respect to, you know, kind of what success is. And I suppose, yeah, as I mentioned, you know, looking at kind of achievement, power, tradition as their main, you know, value groups, I suppose. And in having a conversation with those people around climate change, we kind of thought, actually, initially you wouldn't want to challenge these people, because you want to, as you said before, Jan, get on their hill and think about, actually, you know, have you noticed any changes, you know, around your land or with seasons and things like that? And there are some particular conversations you could have with particular kinds of voters, I suppose, like, you know, farmers, for example. You know, have you noticed any changes with your land or with your way of life? And then bringing that into a wider conversation about, okay, so this is what climate change means. So and then in that, thinking about, okay, so, you know, what changes can you make as a person that are relevant to what matters to you? So, you know, by saying, right, you want to maintain your traditions or kind of, you know, your way of life, I suppose, or future-proofing your career. You know, have you thought about things like energy efficiency, or, you know, those kind of things, and talking about it in a way which is relevant to them and their values, in terms of family, tradition, future-proofing, careers, and things like that. You know, your position in society, what your definition of success is, and then using those points to talk about, you know, climate change and what we can kind of do to contribute to that, or what they can do, but obviously in a way that kind of harks back to their values. So yeah, I think I covered it there. I think the main thing really was just about having a conversation away, which is about, you know, how can we help preserve the things that matter to you, and going from that conversation into a wider conversation about, okay, here's climate change as a bigger picture, as opposed to being like, you know, what you said before, Jan, stop eating meat and you know, all those kind of things. You don't want to be combative in that conversation, I suppose. So that's kind of where we got. I don't know if that covered the brief, but
That's great. I mean, what's interesting is you don't actually know what the responses would be if you ask some of those questions, and that's where the conversation can develop. And I think what you've identified is it's less about telling people what to do and more about finding out what their drivers are. So yeah, no, that's really good. And I think that thing about, have you noticed changes? So it's finding out from them what they have seen, what they have experienced, getting them to tell their own stories. I think that's a very valuable way of doing it. So thank you for that, Scott.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. I think we'll head to Kirsty from Dumfries now, if you want to put your mic on and share your chat.
Yeah, so we had two, well, we chose two different audiences. One was my own personal experience of sort of finding it hard to have conversations with my parents about climate change. And then the second one was somebody that was in our group that lives in Malawi and was talking about charcoal farmers or producers that take charcoal from trees. So it was really interesting, and something that we kind of that came about after discussing these things was that, like, especially for like people that you know quite personally, if you've already had these conversations in the past, it's really hard. It would be hard to then have a conversation where you're sort of looking for their values, because they might be apprehensive to talk about the subjects that you've already spoken with them in the past, because they might feel like the conversation is going to go in a certain way, or you know, if you're already passionate about something, they'll be like, oh, they just want to tell me what they're passionate about. They don't really want to know my views. So it was just interesting to like have to think about that going into conversations. And yeah, it'd be
right,
interesting.
if people are used to you saying what you think they should be doing, or at least, you know, what's important to you, it can be quite a challenge to flip that to try and find out, you know, examples from them. So I think you're right. Thank you, Kirsty. It's good.
Yeah, but thankfully, I mean, not thankfully, I mean, definitely not thankfully, but obviously there are so many aspects to do with climate change. Like there's, you know, it's like a huge picture. So I'm sure there'll be something that you could find to start a conversation about that you haven't talked about before. Yeah.
It was interesting, obviously, to hear from you as well about experiences in Malawi, because that's the great thing about this program, is you're getting to see lots and lots of different perspectives of things. So great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. It's really interesting to hear what your group's been chatting about. I think we'll move to Laura next, if you want to share.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, Grant. Okay, so my group, we sort of took, I guess we started with two different examples. So the first one was how to talk to older relatives and kind of show them that climate change is relevant to them and it's not just a young person's topic. And we also spoke about how to engage with younger people and how to show them that climate change is sort of a cool topic, an interesting topic. And what we kind of came down to was how to localise the concept to speak to people on their level. So, for example, instead of talking about climate change as a massive topic and talking about statistics such as climate change has displaced 4 billion people, you might talk about something a little bit closer to home. For example, I think Deborah mentioned in her presentation this morning about children not being able to distinguish between bees and wasps. And that might be something that people here can connect with a little bit more, and something that they can empathise with. And sort of connected to that, we also spoke about the value of enjoying life as being a common value that everyone can share, and that's an area where you can probably always find some common ground. Then we also strayed into politics a little bit too. So we were sort of talking about, can you talk to your family members about politics and how do those conversations normally go? And kind of what we came down to was that at the moment, certainly in Scotland, politics is really divisive. And right now people are more probably talking about what camp they fit into on independence rather than actually their values on different policy areas. So we're not really having conversations, or in our experience, for example, in family discussions about politics, it's not conversations about what are your values on the environment or health or education and what parties fit with those, but what's your position on independence. And Sophie and our team had a really nice example of a family member who had changed a really long-held political allegiance just through conversations on values on different policy topics, and that family member realising that actually the party they'd been voting for didn't reflect those values. So yeah, really interesting discussion.
Great, thank you. I mean, that's really interesting because sometimes people say, well, I don't want to talk about politics, but I want to talk about education, or I want to talk, everything has a political perspective. So yeah, thank you for bringing that in as well, Laura. That sounds really interesting.
Thanks.
Is there one more group then?
Yeah, we've got one more group left. I think Emma's going to share from her group.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, so we decided to focus on someone who was young, potentially from a wealthy background, and who was a climate denier. And on the values, we thought that the values closest to this person might be in the power security group mainly, so things like family security and social order, wealth, and also maybe enjoying life and self-indulgent and excitement in life. So we wanted to say, similar to the first group, ask about if the person's seen any difference in extreme events and extreme weather recently and what might explain that. And then also, because it's a young person, we thought we could ask what their ideal future would look like, because we had the idea that that might actually be quite similar to what we would want to see in the future. Also about framing wealth, so asking what the plan is for making money or wealth in the future, and talking about future investments and changes in things like EV prices, so sort of more of a money sort of traditional economic focus potentially. And then also there's a link to enjoying life and self-indulgence. We could talk about adventure holidays and how those could be disrupted, or things like skiing, or linking to those sort of activities that the person might be interested in. Yeah, if anyone wants to chip in from the group, I don't know if I've mentioned everything there.
Sounds like a really good summary to me. No, it's interesting when you do start to think about someone who you might actually have a conversation with. So do you know someone who has those values? And it starts you to think about, how can I tap into those? How can I find something that enables us to talk about climate change, but maybe common ground as well? So finding out what all those things linked together. So thank you. That was a really interesting bit of feedback then. And I think if nothing else, the basic human values tool is something that you can use in lots and lots of different ways. I've used it in organizations to do heat maps. So you might take a team or a particular group and you do a heat map of where the values are. And that really starts to help them to understand why there are differences in perspective, but also how they can work together to achieve things, particularly if they're looking at a group as implementing a sustainability policy in their organisation. So what sorts of things would appeal to them? So I think that tool has quite a lot of use. I think when you first look at it, it looks a bit complicated, but actually you can boil it down to 3 or 4 points. So I just wanted to finish up by talking about a couple of the skills that you might have used in your group. But what I was hoping was that I can change my slide. That's it. In terms of your reflections, what we were looking to hear from you now, this is what you did. What happened? What sorts of questions will help you to talk climate? And you talked about what was your ideal future. I like that as a question, because that really gets people to think about, where would you like to be in 10 years' time? How would you like things to be? So that dream element, visioning, is really, really important. So what? So after the exercise, what conclusions could you draw about using values in your conversations when you're trying to talk climate? And when can you next have that climate conversation? It could be when you go to see your parents. It could be when you're having a conversation with that person at work, and actually trying this out. So 3 whats. What happened? What did you observe? So this is what you were feeding back to us. And I'm not sure if you actually had the conversations or if you just talked about the conversations. But the 3 whats are an evaluation tool. So the first one is what happened. Second is so what? And then what next? So what can you apply from what we've looked at today? What information can you share with your peers? So the exercise today is a fairly quick one. I would normally do this as part of a much bigger workshop around how we communicate climate change, but get people to think about values as part of that. So you've shared your thoughts. We've thought about that. That's great. Thank you. Some skills to develop. Just a couple of things you might want to consider. This concept of asking more questions, so seeking to understand rather than reply. So trying to understand other people before we try and give them our messages. Understanding the impact of asking questions. Listening for those values, because people will disclose what's important to them. And then another skill is about paraphrasing to demonstrate that you've understood. So why do we ask more questions? What we ask people about is what they learn about. Questions are incredibly powerful. And the more you can practice asking them rather than telling, the more skilled you become at this. There are some really good questions. We call them TED questions. And this is the stem for the question is TED. So can you tell me some more about that? So someone said something, rather than you telling them, you're asking them to tell you some more. Can they explain what they mean by something? These are really good follow-up questions. And can you describe an example of that for me? So when we're talking with people who think might have different political viewpoints, we might want to jump in with our own political perspective. But by trying to understand a bit more about where they're coming from, tell, explain and describe can be useful stems to follow up with. And summarising question stems, how we get to check that we've understood what someone said. So if I hear you correctly, you're saying whatever it is they've said, and they can either go, no, you completely misunderstood me, or yeah, you've shown that you've understood. So you mean that X, Y, Z, is that right? Did I understand you right when you said that? So summarising, paraphrasing, feeding that back to people is an important way of showing that we've understood them. So I just wanted to finish up and to see if there were any questions that anyone's got.
If anyone does have a question, you could either post a Y in the chat, or you can also use the reactions feature to put a thumbs up and we'll come around to you.
I have a question, Jan. Have you ever had a really difficult conversation, but that it's then become very successful as a result of this approach?
I mentioned my brother-in-law. For years, my partner, who is his brother, had been, my partner's a climate scientist. He's led the greenest life I can imagine. And his brother, obviously hasn't, because of his hedonistic lifestyle. So my partner would say to his brother, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, you need to do more of this, less of that. And then one day I sat down with my brother-in-law and had just had a conversation and said, I need to understand why you do the things that you do. And as a result of that, he obviously hasn't been to Spain for the last year, but the next time he goes, he's going to go by train. So he's chosen to make that difference. And also around his diet, he's a brilliant cook, but he does like to use a lot of meat. And what we did was look at his carbon footprint and see how much of that was coming through his diet. And he was just blown away. He went, two things I could do something about, flying and my diet. Why don't I just choose to eat less meat? I'm not going to give it up completely, but he's chosen to cut down on his particular red meat consumption, which has been really powerful. So yes, and it was quite a tricky one because obviously my partner has been banging on about this for years and had no impact. So yeah, thank you. That's a good question.
It's a great question, Rachel. We were actually talking about that in our own breakout room.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear your answer, Jan. We have a question in the chat from Debbie who asks, how can this approach be used outside of one-to-one conversations, i.e. in groups or to like wider groups that might not hold common values?
Yeah. This is why things like the heat map can be helpful. I would always encourage small group conversations because everyone gets a chance to speak then. But having a heat map for a group can actually see where those pinch points might be. And it's not about saying people are wrong or you've got the wrong values, because people's values are what they are. That is part of what makes them themselves. But that's not to say that values can't change. Because I know that the values I had when I was 16 are very, very different to the values that I have now. So you have to be careful if you're doing that with a bigger group, not to say, oh, down in that bottom right-hand corner is the naughty stuff. And you all ought to be in the top left-hand corner. But just acknowledging, and if you do it in a way which doesn't identify whose values are which, you can start to see, well, if we were having conversations with these people, or conversations from our perspective, how might we uncover, as we did in this exercise today, how might we uncover what's important to people? So I would absolutely say no preaching, no telling people what to do, no dictating, because it doesn't work. But the more you can find out through either one-to-one conversations or smaller group conversations about what's the impact of that bigger picture, then that can be a way to use it. Yeah,
for sure. I don't want to run over time too much, but perhaps you can answer this last question quickly. Rebecca asks, how about if someone is wrong about facts or is like missing links between information? How do you correct them without them feeling attacked?
I was reading a really interesting article this morning about Blue Peter badges. I don't know if anyone else has read that, but they're offering green badges to young people. And there was a big discussion because they had originally put in there that people could choose to not eat meat. And the meat industry just went berserk about this. So, and I haven't seen the film Seaspiracy, but some people say that some of the facts in those that is not correct. That does undermine an argument, I have to say. But if someone else is quoting things which are incorrect, I would just try and explore with them what their source is, because they might just have picked it up inaccurately, and just try and find out from them how robust their source material is, and then maybe would they consider looking at something from a different perspective. And that's sometimes the most you can do. I mean, the whole subsidy of the dairy industry is a huge one, and how people are told they have to drink milk from a very early age is just to do with our funding of the dairy industry. So yes, in answer to your question, just a gentle probe, a gentle challenge about where did that information come from. I'm really interested in that. Tell me some more about that. Can you describe where you got that information from? So maybe using some TED questions around that.
Yeah, that's a really good way of approaching it. And there's definitely a lot of chat at the moment about Seaspiracy, but we'll have to leave that for another day because I think that would take up a good hour.
Yeah.
So thank you so much to everyone for your questions, and also to Jan for being here today and providing such an interesting workshop. It's definitely benefited me, and I'm sure it's benefited everyone else. So today we've had 2 really fantastic sessions. A huge thank you to our 2 speakers, Dr. Deborah Long and Dr. Jan Maskell. In Deborah's opening session, we learned more about the green recovery, as well as a wonderful lesson in the importance of prioritising nature for the sake of the planet and for our own physical and emotional health. We also learned about the value and necessity of working together to overcome challenges, especially around the green recovery, and a reminder that planetary emergencies require local solutions, and that Scotland needs to, quote unquote, walk the green walk. Then we had another amazing session from Jan where we learned about this human basic values model. I'm not going to repeat that word and mess it up again. And we had a bit of fun practicing trying to understand others' top 3 core values. What we can take from this is that in order to encourage others to take meaningful climate action, or perhaps even to inspire other people to take action through our own actions, we need to understand values and get on top of each other's hilltops. So a lot of content for us all to consider going forward, and we hope you all agree extremely valuable information that is transferable to a number of areas of your own lives, but particularly in inspiring meaningful climate action towards a green recovery for Scotland and beyond. So just a final massive note of gratitude again to Deborah and to Jan, and we encourage you all to continue to follow the fantastic work that they are doing. Also, we'll quickly mention that this is Earth Day is coming up on Thursday the 22nd, I believe. And Earth Day is another great day to get involved with events or to take climate actions. And we've got a link to share with you about Earth Day as well, if you're not sure what Earth Day is or what it involves. Speaking of taking climate action, we at 2050 have our own small 2050 story campaign, an initiative where you can share what climate actions you've been taking or what you're up to in terms of your own climate action journey. The link for that can be found in the What's Next section of your programme that we shared with you before the event, and it's also on the website as a guest blog. So yeah, share whatever you're up to in terms of your climate action journey with us. There's also in the programme quite a lot of additional resources that we pulled together that give you a bit more background about the green recovery, and they'd be really good to have a read if you didn't get a chance to before the event. And yeah, I think that's us. So again, huge thank you to everyone for participating today. Thank you to Jan and to Deborah. We're going to finish up there and leave the room open if you want to stick behind, or if you don't want to stick behind, then off you go and have a great rest of your Saturday. So thank you very much, everyone. A virtual round of applause again.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak.
Thank you so much, Jan.
Enjoy your day. Bye.